Hear these words from the Gospel of John, chapter 21. After these things, Jesus showed himself again to the disciples by the Sea of Tiberias, and he showed himself in this way. Gathered there together were Simon Peter, Thomas, called the twin, Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and two others of his disciples. Simon Peter said to them, "I'm going fishing." They said to him, "We will go with you." They went out and got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. Just after daybreak, Jesus stood on the beach, but the disciples did not know that it was Jesus. Jesus said to them, "Children, you have no fish, have you?" They answered him, "No." He said to them, "Cast the net to the right side of the boat, and you'll find some." So they cast it, and now they were not able to haul it in because there were so many fish. That disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, "It is the Lord." When Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put on some clothes, for he was naked, and jumped into the sea. But the other disciples came in the boat, dragging the net full of fish, for they were not far from the land, only about 100 yards off. When they had gone ashore, they saw a charcoal fire there with fish on it and bread. Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish that you have just caught." So Simon Peter went aboard and hauled the net ashore full of large fish, 153 of them. And though there were so many, the net was not torn. Jesus said to them, "Come and have breakfast." Now none of the disciples dared to ask him, "Who are you?" because they knew it was the Lord. Jesus came and took the bread and gave it to them and did the same with the fish. This was now the third time that Jesus appeared to the disciples after he was raised from the dead. When they'd finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" He said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Feed my lambs." A second time he said to him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" He said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Tend my sheep." He said to him the third time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter felt hurt because he said to him the third time, "Do you love me?" And he said to him, "Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Feed my sheep. Very truly, I tell you, when you were younger, you used to fasten your own belt and to go wherever you wished. But when you grow old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will fasten a belt around you and take you where you do not wish to go." He said this to indicate the kind of death by which he would glorify God. After this, he said to him, "Follow me." May God add a blessing to our understanding of the reading of these words. Well, as I spoke at the beginning, here we are, really coming to the middle of the Easter season, and we're tempted to allow some of the glow of that Easter morning to fade with time. But we are in Eastertide. It's not just that one day that we celebrate the resurrection. It's easy just to celebrate Easter as a rite of spring, and we do that. We see the new flowers, the grass greening, receive the rain showers. But we can't forget about the true gift that was given to us in the resurrection, and that is the renewal and revitalization of Christ's ministry. His mandate to carry on the work, not only of tending the sick, feeding the hungry, sheltering the homeless, visiting the prisoner, but also the work of discovery and understanding of how to go about loving our neighbor as ourselves in a world of strife and hatred and violence. Jesus' ultimate command To love one's neighbor as oneself echoes down through the ages, and we still ask the question, who is my neighbor? Well, let's look deeper into this message of the gospel reading this morning, the Gospel of John, the last gospel to be written down, much later than the other gospels. John had a lot of time to think about the meaning of everything they had received, including this meal. And the disciples were still stunned and confused about after this death and resurrection of Jesus, who then suddenly appeared to them in surprising ways, but he didn't stay there. He'd pop up here and there. Mary Magdalene had seen him first at the tomb. Then he appeared to the rest of the disciples when they were in this locked room, when Thomas wasn't with them. And then again a week later when Thomas was there and verified for himself that it was Jesus and said, "My Lord and my God." This time that we read about was a more extended appearance, both in amount of time and the words that he spoke to them. He stands on the shore while it says 7 of the disciples, presumably those who were primarily fishermen, when Jesus had first called them. They'd been out all night and caught nothing. But the dawn puts a new light on everything. And the person appears on the shore to be who looks like a stranger to them, perceives they caught no fish, and tells them, "Cast your net to the right side of the boat, and you'll find some." Imagine what they thought about that. They must have doubted this stranger's advice. After all, they'd been fishing through the night and caught nothing. What difference would it make which side of the boat they cast their net on? But they must have thought, well, what do we have to lose? Let's give it a try. So they throw out the net, thinking they'd probably prove that stranger wrong. And suddenly they find the net so full they can't haul it in without the extra hands on deck. And John says to Simon Peter, "It's the Lord." It must be the Lord. Of course, what does Peter do? Impetuous Peter. He jumps in the water to swim ashore, forgetting about the fish, leaving it to the others to pull the full net to shore. Interesting sidelight is that Peter has to put clothes on to go and meet the Lord. Out in the boat, who cares if he's dressed or not? It's these details that puzzle us in these stories, but the lessons don't stop there. Jesus addresses Simon Peter, saying, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" Now, supposedly Jesus means more than the other disciples or any of the others around, any of the other followers. And Peter answered, "Yes, you know that I love you, Lord." And he responds with, "Feed my lambs." And Jesus persists, asks twice more if Peter loves him, and Peter insists that he does. And Jesus responds, "Tend my sheep, feed my sheep." How many times did Jesus ask Peter to affirm his love? 3. How many times did Peter deny he knew Jesus before he was sentenced to be crucified? 3. Another reminder, followed by the instruction to follow me. You know, we're tempted to stop reading there and take heart in the belief that Jesus was there for good, to love and protect from all evil. But that's not the reality. It's true that Christ's Spirit endures, but it's not a shield that'll keep evil from reaching us. Peter's warned that the road will not be an easy one. He too will die as Jesus died. No wonder the question had to be asked so many times if the love of Christ was strong enough to withstand that rejection, the derision, the persecution, and even the martyrdom of those who would follow his way. Well, in the Acts of the Apostles, which we read earlier, there's a more dramatic account of one who was called by Christ, Saul, who would later be called Paul, was hell-bent, you might say, on chasing down any followers of the way that he might find in the synagogues of Damascus and bring them back to Jerusalem, presumably to face the same fate as Jesus of Nazareth. But he's met with a flash of light that strikes him blind, and hears the voice of Jesus saying, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" He's then instructed to go on to Damascus, where he's met by Ananias, who restores his sight, baptizes him, feeds him. He's transformed, and then joins other disciples and proclaims Jesus is the Messiah. Well, I guess you could say at this point the rest is history. Both Peter and Paul begin to spread the gospel to the Jews and Gentiles alike. They did some hard traveling, faced severe persecution, and ultimate death. But the message of the way lived on. Well, looking back at this story of Jesus standing on the shore, we can find direction for ourselves in his advice to the disciples. They may have been bringing in fish, but what they were learning was new meaning to the original call from Jesus for them to follow him, and then he would make them fishers of people. In order to do that successfully, that is, in order to bring people to the true understanding of Jesus' way, they had to cast their nets in the right way and in the right waters. Peter had once ventured out on the water, remember, when he saw Jesus approaching. And when he faltered, Jesus reached out to him and then questioned his faith. Now here at the end, Peter jumps into the water and swims to Jesus on the shore, where he again is drawn to affirm his faith. The parallel is striking. I think it's beautiful. But that gives us, in essence, a summary of the entire gospel in this episode. The words emphasize the hard road we may travel and the need to cast our nets on the right, that is, the righteous side of history. Keep our eyes and our minds open toward injustice in the world, then following Christ's command, pull up and save God's people from the depths of the waters of injustice. Look back through the centuries of persecution and retribution, martyrdom, crusades. It's a bloody history. Wars and new awakenings. Imperialism, subjugation, slavery and brutality. God's people doing evil and God's people doing good. God's people calling themselves to be righteous, or rather, calling themselves righteous, and God's people suffering at the hands of those who mistakenly believe they are righteous. Now here we are in the 21st century, 2,000 years since Jesus was a young man discovering his purpose on earth. And now it is up to us to ask ourselves, have I trusted in God? How many times have I denied the truth of Jesus' words? How many times have I looked the other way when someone was being persecuted or denied acceptance because of the color of their skin or other aspect of their nature? How many times have I thought that it was not my business how someone treats their spouse or their children? How many times have I rationalized the plight of those struggling financially by saying, oh, they need to work harder, all the while believing that I've earned everything I have, forgetting the special advantages I've had for reasons unseen by me? Family connections, discriminatory practices of businesses and governments that favored whiteness, maleness, able-bodiedness, whose strength can be exploited until that strength has waned with age. Must we be struck blind like Saul, or become deaf or unfeeling in order to recognize just how blind, deaf, and out of touch we have been without realizing it? We're all in the same boat here. We've all succumbed to that self-delusion that we're okay, God's taken care of us, and those other people must have done something wrong, or they wouldn't be suffering. Saul was temporarily blinded by light, awakening to new vision. Peter was confused by what seemed impossible until he was repeatedly shown the error of his ways and changed. He and the others cast their net on the right side of the boat. Are we casting our nets on the right side of history? Are we diving into the waters of reality without fear of consequences as we swim toward the one who calls us to be faithful and accept all God's children as brothers and our sisters, knowing that Christ rejected no one who sought the truth? Jesus' harshest words were directed at the hypocrites, those who professed righteousness while ignoring the humanity, the worthiness, the dignity of those with whom they shared God's creation. You know, we don't have to look back so far in history to acknowledge certain moments that should remind us of this message, to be on the right side of history, particularly this week in history. I just read on Facebook a couple of postings that were done yesterday. Someone reminded that on May the 4th, in 1961, it was the first of the Freedom Riders buses that departed for Alabama. People of both races, black and white, boarding buses to protest the segregation in bus depots and stations around the South. And many took their lives in their own hands, and they suffered for it. May 4th, 1970, something that Fran and I remember clearly, and many of you here remember. It was a massive student protest on the campus of Kent State University in Ohio. Tensions were high across the country in protest over the Vietnam War. The president had expanded that war with bombing into new territory, Cambodia, Laos. Passions were high. National Guard was called out thinking they had to contain a riot. 4 innocent people were shot to death on campus. 2 of them were actively protesting. 2 of them were bystanders. They happened to be passing through on their way to class or home from class. What a shock that was to the nation. I think it helped wake us up. But it showed the reality, the injustices that we've continually have to face, that we have to get ourselves on the right side of history to condemn that kind of violence. And this week, this past couple of days, you may have noticed on the news, in Israel, everything came to a halt for 2 minutes and sirens blared in observance of the Holocaust remembrance. One of the most despicable, abominable events of the 20th century. May 8th, 1945, the war ended in Europe, and the world began to see the reality of what had happened when those concentration camps were first opened up. And we began to see and acknowledge the horror. I point these things out because they are touchstones for our memory, for our cultural memory, for our personal memory, that we have to remember those things and acknowledge that was evil. We must look at things that are happening around us, things that affect us, the things we're called to do today in this century that call for us to have courage, to put ourselves on the right side of history, to make sure we don't just get along by going along. Hypocrisy abounds, even thrives in the world today. People love to point the finger at one another and not at themselves. Selfishness, deceit, corruption threaten the integrity of our very institutions, while many so-called Christians pervert the gospel into a license to hate, to exclude, to rationalize material gain as the work of God. Manna from heaven. That's why I'm so blessed, so well off. That's why all these things have just fallen into my lap. How many times must we repeat the mistakes of the past before we set our faces toward the pursuit of the common good for all of God's people? We cast about for political leadership, but what we're looking for is moral leadership. As Christians believing in the resurrection, together with Jews who revere the Almighty God revealed in the Torah, and Muslims who find their faith rooted in the words of the Prophet Muhammad, all children of the God of Abraham, together with all faithful people on earth who seek peace, peace in caring for the common good. It's right there before us. It's right there in the face of each person we meet. This is what we want. We don't want conflict. We don't want hatred. We don't want violence. For the younger people here who don't remember any of those things that I just pointed out that happened before your lifetime, I sympathize with you because I know of the horrors that you have seen. Parkland, that's all I have to say. Shootings, constantly, at schools and churches. This is horrifying. Let's make sure we don't rationalize it. Make it a constitutional issue. That's not what it's about. We're talking about the violence wrought by easily accessible guns, the violence, the evil that is being carried out. And we need all together to address that. And it won't be done by passing laws here and there, watered down restrictions, or doubling down and build more guns, more guns, more guns. Arm the churches, arm the schools. Well, that's where we get into the political mire, and we have to keep our eye on the common good. Trust our own common sense. Trust our faith. Jesus left it in our hands. Let us resolve to continue to keep our heads above water, help draw God's children to the sacred shore of understanding without giving in to these undercurrents of selfishness, of greed and prejudice and hatred. Let's put ourselves on the right side of history, for better or for worse. We have to set aside our own personal well-being. These are large issues I've laid out here that affect all of us, but every one of us has a very personal issue that we may be grappling with. What about the history that we leave, the legacy we leave for our children and our grandchildren? Will they look back and say, I'm proud of what Grandpa did. I'm proud of my grandma. I'm proud of how my parents stood up for me when I was being bullied. Let's seek peace in caring for the common good and agree that the burden's upon us to work to achieve that peace. Thanks be to God. May that be so in the days to come. Amen.